So without further ado, as they say, why don't we start? So our guest speaker today is Dr. David Wright. And David, I don't know if I want to say comes from a long line of people who've been involved with developmental disabilities, but certainly I've gotten to know David through his mother, Jean Wright, who has for many years been an advocate and very strongly involved in the local developmental disability community. And so that's sort of how I met David originally. And so I think his family has been involved with this area for quite a while. So Dr. Wright received his bachelor's degree and his master's in history from McGill University and his doctorate of philosophy and history, I guess PhD in history from Oxford University. He then did a postdoctoral fellowship at Oxford in the history of health and medicine before being appointed a Wellcome Trust lecturer in the history of medicine at Nottingham. He then returned to Canada in 1999 to become the Hanna Chair in the History of Medicine at McMaster University. And during his 11 years there at Mac, he was the chair of the International Society for the Social History of Medicine, the Associate Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, and chair of McMaster University's Curriculum Committee. So a lot of really significant positions. For the past 20 years, he has researched and published on the history of mental disorders, particularly in the history of mental hospitals, resulting in several books and edited volumes. The book that I'm most familiar with is on the history of Down syndrome. It is a phenomenal book. It's really rich and detailed history of Down syndrome. Now, Dr. Wright is currently a professor of history and Canada Research Chair in the history of health policy at McGill University. As mentioned here, 2011 book, Down's the History of a Disability, won the biennial Dingle Prize for the best book in the history of science and medicine, which is a tremendous honor. And he's also co-authored Foreign Practices, Immigrant Doctors in the History of Canadian Medicare, which was published at a very fortuitous time right at the start of the pandemic. And recently, Dr. Wright was elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. So, Dr. Wright, welcome, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Rob, for inviting me, and for all of you for attending virtually, and Sarah for coordinating this event today. I'm just going to, I'm a bit out of practice here, so let's hope that the share screen and everything works fine. Let me try. There, can everyone see that? Yes, hopefully.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. So yeah, it's a delight to be able to give the invited lecture, the keynote today, to the Ben Goldberg. I understand it's the Ben Goldberg Disabilities Research Day. I remember Dr. Goldberg very well from my days at CPRI, and we knew their family very well when I was growing up in the Oak Ridge area of London, Ontario. And so I'm going to shamelessly name drop and place drop a lot because I grew up in London, and so there's going to be a lot of London references.
David, just so you know, Ben is actually in the audience.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
yeah.
Well, Dr. Goldberg, thank you for joining us. I can't actually see. It's one of these where I can't see. So, so I'm delighted you could join us here. For those of you who, I guess I'm jumping ahead in my lecture, but I spent several summers as a research assistant at CPRI, which was then called the Children's Psychiatric Research Institute, working on with Dieter Blendert and Cheryl Hartridge and the Cottage 1314. So those of a certain age will remember. We'll certainly remember those cottages and that environment back in the 1980s, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. So I was asked to talk about the history of Down syndrome, and I'd like to provide, to talk about some dominant themes. This is very much a history presentation, but I hope that you find it relevant and interesting. I always like to start off with this exchange. Rob sort of stole my thunder a bit. So the mother in question here is my own mother, who may or may not also be online right now. But the exchange is the following. Doctor, I don't like the look of her. Mother, after 3 sons, I like the look of her. Doctor, her fingers resemble toes, her ears are very small. Mother, do you think there was some trauma at birth? Doctor, no, I think this happened at conception, hint, hint. Mother, remembering Psych 101, you think she's a Mongoloid? Doctor, yes, do you know any member of parliament? Mother, a member of parliament? Doctor, yes, if you do, you can get her in an institution faster. You shouldn't take her home because it will ruin your family life with your other children. So this is in part my writing of the book on the history of Down syndrome, which was to a certain extent just almost an accident mid-career that somebody asked me to do. It wasn't anything that I planned all my life to do, but it made me reflect and draw upon my own sort of personal history and experience working with, having a sister who was born with Down syndrome, working as a sort of volunteer with what was then called the local association for the community for the mentally retarded, later Community Living London, and also then seeing that become entangled with my own research interests in the Industrial Revolution and the history of medicine. One doesn't often start presentations with a picture of oneself in diapers, but this picture to the left is a photograph of myself and Susie. She was born in 1967 when we lived in Toronto. My dad was then doing his postgraduate degree in periodontistry. This came to the knowledge of the local pediatric professor at Sick Kids in Toronto, who's doing research on blood disorders, possible blood disorders, and what was then called Mongolism. And so I begin the book with an anecdote about how her researchers came to our house to sort of draw blood from my brothers and me, just to see if there's any sort of any way of detecting that we were siblings of a Mongoloid child. Again, I'm going to use the term of the time. Of course, this is extremely problematic terms, but I'm going to explain how the language and social values change over time and evolved. Now, arising from the exchange in the previous slide, my mother and father declined sending my sister to an institution and insisted that she be raised with the rest, along with the rest of my brothers, in a home that my parents moved into in London, Ontario in 1968. And she was raised with us. And there's a picture on the right in London of Susie and me. And Susie became, in many respects, sort of the figurative and literal poster girl for Down syndrome in the 1970s. She was very socially adept, and I have a whole array of photographs from her childhood. This is one with the then mayor of London. It's a lovely photograph. She's planting seeds for a ceremonial tree. I kind of remember what the occasion was, but then she started actually planting the bag that the seeds came in as well, which is why he's laughing. It's just a beautiful photograph. But there's also, she befriended David Peterson, who, when he was Premier of Ontario, he of course was from London and was, I think, an honorary member of the Board of Governors of SARI, the Special Ability Riding Institute, which I think still operates to this day. As well as having met Brian Mulroney and other prime ministers. Some very funny pictures of her chewing out Brian Mulroney over some issue. Now, I was very much just a sibling, right? I was, just so happened that my sister was born with Down syndrome. I sort of went about doing what, sort of an average kid in the Oak Ridge community would do growing up. And I didn't reflect too much on issues of disability and social integration. These were very much things that my parents had to confront. And it's only, of course, as an adult, you start to reflect upon how these were quite sort of groundbreaking battles in terms of normalization and social integration. However, when I went to McGill and I started reading history and I became interested in medical institutions, social institutions during the Industrial Revolution, I used to come back to London, and Dieter Blindert, who was a very well-known psychologist who worked for CPRI, he was a good friend of the family and had helped my parents in various sort of battles and setting up voluntary organizations and the like. So I worked for him and for Cheryl Hartridge, who I think is still in London as working in brain injury clinic, heading a brain injury clinic. So anyways, I have very fond memories of working in the summers as an undergrad and master's student at CPRI. And that really sort of fueled my interest in the dynamics of institutionalization and discharge, right? And particularly the role of the family in terms of the timing of admission, in terms of whether or not children or young adults would be accepted back in the community. And as I read historically, it seemed to me that all the major literature, of course, many people will be familiar with Michel Foucault's work or Elaine Showalter's work, but most of the literature was actually on the history of quote unquote madness, of sort of psychiatric history, of psychiatric institutions. And there was very, very little written about the history of developmental disability institutions, for lack of a better word. Of course, they were called something different back then, and I'll get to that in a moment. So this sort of interconnection, I didn't do this sort of symmetry on purpose, like a CPR, making CPRI look like McGill, but there's this sort of this sense of sort of symbiosis of exchange of ideas, my sort of own history training, and gradually my graduate research interest in the history of medical institutions, and then ultimately the history of developmental disability institutions. So I went off to England to do my doctorate in the early 1990s, and I became interested in the first formal institution for the developmentally disabled in the English-speaking world. And this was known as the Earlswood Asylum. And here's a depiction. It just so happens, I didn't do this on purpose. That framed print behind me is actually the Earlswood Asylum. So I wrote my doctoral thesis at Oxford on the Earlswood Asylum. And the reason why I was interested in it was sort of multifold. It was quite a large institution, 400 or 500 residents there. And it was also a charitable institution. So this was not part of the poor law, the Dickensian poor law, or what have you. This was a charitable institution that drew on funds from wealthier members of society who then became, subscribers, what were known as subscribers to the medical institution. And they would get lists of candidates that they would vote on and elect, quite literally elect, to be residents of the institution. And this is an election card, and they have these elections twice a year, and a picture of Frederick Munns, who was ultimately admitted. Now, for the purpose of the history of Down syndrome, the other fascinating aspect about Earlswood was its second medical superintendent. So not to provide too much information about the way the medical legal framework worked in Victorian England, and for that matter, Canada, but all these residential facilities that accepted either developmentally disabled or psychiatric patients had to have a medically trained individual as superintendent. That was a law. And so the second medical superintendent of Earlswood was none other than John Langdon Down. And by the way, his name is sort of described sort of differently. He was originally John Down and then Langdon Down with a hyphen or what have you. It was a thing about the Victorians that as you rose in social stature, people often had double-barreled last names as a way of making it seem you were more sort of respectable. Anyway, so John Langdon Down was the second medical superintendent who, interestingly enough, was an amateur photographer and went around in using the glass plate photography to photograph the patients at Earlswood. And this was for, partly because he was interested in portrait photography, partly because these were sold to subscribers, to members of the community, to again raise money for the institution. Sometimes they were printed and affixed in the medical casebooks. But as Langdon Down did this, he became very interested in a group of patients whom he believed all looked similar. And very much in the context of the 1860s, in context of debates over race and over evolution, he developed his ideas about what he called a racial or ethnic classification of the residents, of idiots, again, to use the medical legal term of the time. And he writes a paper in 1866, 67, in which he describes the what he calls the ethnic classification, and particularly those who he thought belonged to again, to use the Victorian sort of anthropological turn of phrase, a great Mongolian family. And he goes on to describe the characteristics that we would now associate with Down syndrome. Now, his broad ethnic classification was sort of, poo-pooed and dismissed by most people, but the term Mongolism became quite useful and was used for a couple of generations, even though most of his peers didn't sort of buy this idea of racial movement. So that is that, Caucasians could become Mongols, and, those who are Africans could become Asiatic. And, they didn't buy this. This doesn't make any sense. But the term Mongolism did catch on. Now, Langdon Down himself, as many public asylum superintendents, ended up establishing a private institution later on in life because he could make more money doing that, and he became quite well known. And he passed this institution, which is called Normansfield, which is where the Langdon Down Centre is situated in Britain. It's just sort of a suburb of London. So Normansfield, and then he passed that down through a couple generations of Langdon Downs. This is his more famous of his two sons, Reginald Langdon Down, who became famous himself for identifying the so-called single palmar crease, which was also known informally as the simian crease. Improbably, Reginald Langdon Down had 3 children, and his youngest child, John himself, was born with Down syndrome. And that is quite an extraordinary sort of coincidence of history. So by the early 20th century, the institutions, these small charitable institutions for the developmentally disabled, are supplemented by large and larger state institutions, particularly obviously in North America because of the constitutional structure, funded by provinces or by American states. So you have a state or provincial institution for, as it were, idiot and imbecile children. The one in Ontario, those of you would be familiar with, was established in 1876, is the Earl Asylum. And that was the first provincial institution. Again, partly justified by the fact that there were other large psychiatric facilities like the London Psych and the Hamilton Psych and Toronto Psych and Kingston Psych. And it was deemed that these weren't appropriate places for children with developmental disabilities. They should have a separate institution for them. So that was Aurelia, which was later the Ontario Hospital for Children, Aurelia, and then eventually is rechristened as a Huronia Regional Center. But the early 20th century was very much a period of sort of mass institutionalization, where educational experts, doctors, members of the general public persuaded parents that the most appropriate and indeed humane thing to do, both for their children and for their family members, was to institutionalize them, often for life in these institutions. So by the middle of the 20th century, you have quite sort of extraordinarily large institutions. This is a picture of Oxford Regional Center, ORC, near Woodstock, in the 1960s. And you get a sense of just, these are effectively communities in and amongst themselves, large pavilion buildings and different types of other administrative buildings around. And it's if I may digress slightly, there's been a number of very interesting sort of memoirs that have been written by siblings of children who were institutionalized about mid-century. These memoirs have sort of come out reflecting on how their sibling was sort of sent away or taken away to these institutions, whether ORC or Smith Falls or Blenheim or what have you. And so I just want to sort of note that for those of you who are sort of interested in a sort of a reflection of that era and the impact on other family members, right, of institutionalization. And at the risk of also sort of stating something that people are sort of familiar with, many of these institutions became subject to class action lawsuits after they were closed in the 1980s and 90s, by former residents and family members. So there are all these regional centers. What ultimately became, and Dr. Goldberg would know the terminology better than I, when this happened, sort of Schedule 1 facilities that were dotted around Ontario. Now, the interesting thing about CPRI is actually it wasn't a developmental, if I recall correctly, originally a sort of purpose-built Schedule 1 facility. It was actually a tuberculosis sanatorium, hence the name Sanatorium Road. But by the 1950s, with the advent of streptomycin, sort of the TB sanatoria were sort of emptied over a short period of time, and some of them got converted into developmental disability institutions. So, so you have this sort of rise of institutional development and institutionalization that's going on very much in the first half of the 20th century, sort of reaching its apex in the first half of the 20th century. But meanwhile, there's also sort of a scientific interest in, as it were, Mongolism, to use the term of the time. There's many, many scientific papers, medical papers, treaties that are published looking at, mental development, social adaptability, but also trying to figure out etiology. What were the origins of this common condition? And there are a lot of theories that were bouncing around the scientific community. Some people attributed it to something the parents had done. They knew it was sort of congenital. So, was it due to alcoholism? Was it due to sort of syphilis amongst the parents? What type of sort of, infectious disease or behavior, whatever was contributing to the vulnerability of having a child with Mongolism. Now, a small portion of the scientific community became interested in the emergence of genetics and then later what became known as human genetics by the 1950s. And one of the interesting aspects, and I'm not a historian of science, so forgive me for the generalizations here, but one of the interesting aspects of human genetics in the 1950s was the inability to see the chromosomes properly. And this was a sort of technical issue of microphotography that the various teams around the world were trying to sort out. And so there's this sort of, not quite a sort of space race, but there was this scientific race of sort of chromosomal microphotography going on, in which people were trying different techniques so they could see the sets of chromosomes and see whether there's any chromosomal anomaly attached to not only Mongolism, but other conditions. And so this sort of scientific race was won by a French team under a French senior researcher named Turpin. But the researcher who got most of the credit was Jérôme Lejeune. Here's the top right is actually a photograph, one of the early photographs from Lejeune's research team, which he strongly believed reflected it. It shows you how hard these are to read, right? The top right one, not the lower right, which is a more organized sort of Denver karyotype system. And so he went to his boss. He said, I think I think it's a trisomy, and Turpin was like looking at the photograph saying, no, I'm not sure, but why don't you go to the International Congress of Genetics, which is going on next year in Montreal in 1958. But don't tell anybody. But don't tell anybody about this because you may be right, but also it's too early to publish. So Lejeune heads across on the liner to Montreal in 1958, but he was a bit of a blabbermouth, and he's talking to people at the conference in Montreal about his potential discovery. And so he gets invited to McGill to give a seminar by the head of the genetics department at McGill, and says, "Listen, here are my photographs. I really think that Mongolism is due to a trisomy." And so he goes back and he admits to his boss that he had actually let the cat out of the bag. And so they rush a sort of paper in a press through some friends of theirs. So it wasn't even sort of peer reviewed very well, but they were the first to get their names on a paper that was then ultimately replicated by the other teams and showed that in fact that Down syndrome, or that Mongolism was due to a trisomy on the 21st chromosome. Now, as it turns out, they measured the chromosomes incorrectly, so it really wasn't the 21st chromosome, but it was repeated so often that they didn't want to renumber. It was supposed to be on size of chromosome, and again, the techniques were so imprecise at that time. So Jérôme Lejeune becomes a French national scientific hero. He is feted around the world, including receiving the Presidential Medal of Honor from John F. Kennedy, who himself, for those of you who know about the Kennedy family, was quite interested in what was then called mental retardation. And so that's Lejeune, the second from the right, from receiving the Presidential Medal of Honor. He becomes a full professor in the French term in France at quite a young age, and becomes a sort of paterfamilias of Down syndrome in France, and a whole foundation's established after him, the Fondation Lejeune, which continues to this day. Now, there's yet a very, very long and interesting and controversial story in France about this discovery, because just about a decade ago, one of his research team, Martha Gauthier, said that in fact he stole her discovery. And as a female researcher, as part of the lab in the 1950s, she was sort of disempowered and unable to stand up to either Turpin or to Lejeune. And she exposed this in a French journal called Médecine Science, and on the 50th anniversary of the discovery of Trisomy 21. And so this caused a huge blow up in France and lawsuits and all sorts of things. But by this time, Lejeune had passed away and so wasn't able to defend himself publicly. And so it was a very, very interesting debate about science and gender and the politics of the lab at the middle of the 20th century. Nevertheless, it did cause a bit of sort of a linguistic, as it were, crisis. So, what should it be called? Now that it was clear it was a chromosomal anomaly, and so the English-speaking world decided, we should just call it Down syndrome. Originally with apostrophe, and then later in North America, largely without apostrophe. Whereas the French-speaking world largely shunned that and referred to, didn't refer to it as Lejeune, although there are some people who argued it's sort of Lejeune's disease, but referred to Trisomy 21. And so, but that's, as it were, was a sort of interesting nationalist linguistic debate that went on by the 1960s and 70s. So meanwhile, so that all more or less occurs at the dawn of the 1960s. And you do see in the 60s and 70s a sort of social and intellectual movement that also affects, as it were, the adult psychiatric community, of moving away from long stay facilities, long stay state and provincial psychiatric facilities. And within the developmental disability literature, the sort of the intellectual fuel, if I can put it that way, for this were a number of books, most famous of which was by the easy to remember Wolfensberger, who published The Principle of Normalization in 1972. Now, there is other sort of analogous types of books in the Scandinavian literature in the 1960s, but Wolfensberger became sort of the, as it were, the most famous author and advocate of what became known as normalization, and certain sort of terms and approaches like least restrictive environments and social role valorization and the like. And if I remember correctly, he wrote this book mainly in Toronto at what used to be called the National Institute for Mental Retardation, and then was renamed the Rohr Institute, which I think is attached to York University. And so the 1970s, and this is to double back, the era in which I'm sort of watching my parents argue with, the principal across the street about Susie attending primary school, and, all the sort of the normal activities that were being denied children with Down syndrome in the 1970s. That these debates start to play out. And you start to see separate schools being established, or day schools, and different social and leisure activities being organized. And here, I think it's easy to just focus on the Wolfensbergers of this world, or perhaps the formal institutions, and forget that there was a whole social history of parent networks that met in the bottom of church basements, and and liaised with each other in terms of providing interpersonal supports, but also advocating for activities for their children that were being denied, as it were, in mainstream institutions. This is just some photographs, again, sort of shamelessly dropped in from London in the 1950s. This is giving you a sort of sense of the informality, but also the important role of parents who sort of unexpectedly found themselves in the sort of center of many of these debates at that time. Slowly, over time, one sees enough advocacy and lobbying that local elementary school boards start to become involved, again, often in cooperation with voluntary organizations, to establish daycares and schools for quote unquote retarded children throughout, as early, but it's perhaps a bit earlier than people would expect, in the 50s and 60s, and then it gains momentum. Now, this is very much a sort of condensed, sort of broad themes of what I talk about in my book. But I do think that the 1970s and 80s were a sort of fascinating turning point in terms of normalization, to use that term, of social integration of developmentally disabled children and young adults. There was not only the battles for access to local public schools, and usually these were unsuccessful. I certainly recall in London that the first generation, there's usually a school that was the school for the developmentally disabled. There wasn't a classroom for the developmentally disabled in your local area. You would have your child bused to one school that was the developmental disabled, the mental retardation school in the city. One also sees the creation of sort of transition homes or group homes as many of these Schedule I facilities start to be downsized by the 1980s, or where parents start to demand sort of alternatives, sort of ex-domiciliary alternatives that aren't sort of full institutionalization. One of the topics that people really don't talk about too much is actually the revolution in cardiac surgery. And I know this might seem sort of a bizarre point to slip into this broad social history, but it was fairly well known in the 1970s that pediatric surgeons who specialized in cardiac anomalies and abnormalities, which are very common in Down syndrome infants, would simply refuse to engage in surgical correction, would, as it were, allow nature to take its course. And it took quite a while. It took a lot of lobbying. It took a lot of debate within the surgical community to have a sort of widespread acceptance that surgical interventions for Down syndrome infants was appropriate and ethical and desirable. And that has a huge impact on life expectancy of infants and small children born with cardiac problems who also have Down syndrome. Other interesting sort of challenges and debates and victories of the time. It was for a long period of time, those who were resident in prisons and psychiatric facilities were denied the right to vote. And this, by the 1970s and 80s, there's multiple court challenges to give the right to vote to individuals who had Down syndrome, either in the institution or community environment. Then there's ongoing, as there is today, challenges in terms of success in terms of gainful employment, and debates about the desirability or not of what used to be called shelter workshops, which were quasi-employment situations, usually subsidized by the government, run by voluntary organizations, in which young adults with Down syndrome and other developmental disabilities would work, but often not get paid or be paid under minimum wage, and then the whole ethical debate about whether this was desirable or not. So one does see over the course of the 80s and 90s a degree of social integration, even sort of cultural representation. One of the most noteworthy characters, I think, in the 1990s in terms of and 2000s was Lauren Potter in Glee. There are actually two Down syndrome, for those who were Glee fanatics or grew up with Glee, two Down syndrome characters in Glee, which was quite something to see sort of the mainstreaming in culture of that. Now, underlying many of the sort of the advances or progress, one can put it that way, in terms of social integration of individuals with Down syndrome in the 80s and 90s was a lingering issue of prenatal diagnosis, particularly amniocentesis. Now here, again, to double back to an earlier theme, one of the fascinating aspects about Jérôme Lejeune was that he was a devout Catholic and anti-abortion activist who actually who looked back on his life with a sense of horror, because what he had felt that, discovering the trisomy 21 was something that would lead ultimately to some sort of cure, some sort of strong therapeutic intervention. And in fact, what happened was it opened the door, and combined with the legalization of abortion, to see very high rates of termination of Down syndrome fetuses, and so he becomes paradoxically, a prominent anti-abortion advocate in France, sort of denouncing his own scientific discovery. In the book, I talk about his rather fascinating friendship with Jean Paul II, and how he was appointed to the Vatican scientific community, and he becomes, he really does have this incredible ambivalence about his scientific career as a devout Catholic. And so, but amniocentesis, becomes, and genetic testing becomes generalized in the 1970s, and it's advanced by the liberalization, decriminalization of abortion in most Western countries during this time, and that has led to this what I sort of broadly characterize as this dualistic state of society's attitudes towards Down syndrome. On the one hand, there's been the emergence of Down syndrome societies internationally, of international Down syndrome organizations that lobby and attempt to valorize and support the integration of Down syndrome children and adults. Here's a lovely portrait of a Japanese dancer that I was made aware of when I went to Japan for the Japanese translation of the book, and to see sort of active Japanese Down syndrome society there. On the other hand, there are sort of absolutely fascinating, somewhat destabilizing articles, such as the one that was in the Atlantic Monthly about 2 years ago, talking about the demographic impact of universal prenatal testing, and how that could potentially lead to the end of Down syndrome adults and children if it continued, that they were disappearing, as were the disappearance, the last children of Down syndrome, as the Atlantic Monthly author put it. For anyone who hasn't read that, I think it's extremely sort of sensitively done in terms of its coverage. So by way of sort of final comments, and then I'm happy to take questions and talk about different themes arising. I just like to double back and thank my sister Susan for allowing me to tell her life story in these presentations. Susie is alive and well, and who knows, may even be watching this presentation right now. So hello, Susie, if you're watching. Living in a group home in London, Ontario, and she is actually the eponym for an award for developmental disabilities at the University of Manitoba. And here's another lovely connection to London that was established by the then Dean of Medicine, Brian Hennon, who I know had a strong connection with the Developmental Disabilities program in London, and so I thought I'd sort of on an upbeat note, just show this picture of Susie and her then husband, John Bell, who sadly passed away 2 years ago, as at their wedding, as a sort of representative of the sort of life coming full circle, and the lifelong connection that she has had, that I've had, that my family's had, to developmental disability programs and research in Canada. So I think I'll end it there, and I'm happy to take questions from people.
So David, thank you again. I mean, this is just an incredible talk, and a really great sort of history of Down syndrome and intellectual disabilities in general. And I think it says a lot about how far we've come. There's obviously a long way to go, but if Susie was born in 1967, she would be 55 now, or turning 55 this year. And what I think is remarkable is that one generation ago, people with Down syndrome wouldn't have lived that long, for the most part. I mean, I think that we've come a long way in terms of medical care, and I suppose cardiac surgeons now being willing to do surgery probably has something to do with that. But it's quite remarkable how things have changed.
Yeah, I'm sure somebody has probably worked on life expectancy and Down syndrome. Like I certainly know the data, but there must be a fascinating debate about what are the various influences there. I think, yes, just like the general population, we are living much longer than 150 years ago, not really because people are living much older, but that there's a much lower rate of dying in infancy and childhood, right? Demographics, or historical demography. So, Down syndrome, infants and children, their life expectancy is so much higher than it was a generation ago or 40, 50 years ago. So that's one impact. I think, yeah, nutrition, perhaps, it's a fascinating debate about, the impact of deinstitutionalization in terms of diet and nutrition and exercise, and whether that's had any impact as well. And, general society, there has been an increase in life expectancy in general. So no doubt Down syndrome adults have also benefited from that. So clearly, just to sort of follow on from your question, yes, it used to be historically that, the history of Down syndrome, the history of Mongolism, the history of developmental disabilities was almost ipso facto about children, right? Because there was such a small portion of individuals would live to later adulthood. But now, of course, the literature, and I'm sure there's lots of papers this afternoon about this, or people are interested in this topic, but around the challenges of advanced age and Down syndrome adults, right, being a sort of huge issue, whether it's residential care for individuals with developmental disability late in life, or these I know are sort of really, really challenging issues for researchers and for those working in the field.
Well, and I think with Down syndrome, particularly with the relationship with Alzheimer's disease, and I remember talking with Senator Fisman when she was chair of the Department of Psychiatry,
Right.
about, as somebody who's 50 or 55 with Down syndrome who is developing Alzheimer's, is that appropriate for geriatric psychiatry? Because I think in the past, they've typically sort of said 65 and over. And I think Sandra's position was these are disorders of aging, I suppose. And so felt that really, even regardless of somebody's age, if they had Alzheimer's disease, and they should be cared for by people with expertise in the area.
Yeah.
And which made a lot of sense. So the I don't know if you're aware, but Marguerite Burkhalter, I think her name was in disability studies at Western, and she's written a book about, I think, the experiences of people living in institutions in Ontario. And I think actually your mom said she had gone to one of Marguerite's talks. And I was glad to see you mention Wolf Wolfensberger. He wrote one of the greatest articles ever. It was around the time that the National Association for Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities in the United States was changing their name, and they had a whole edition of the journal devoted to that. And his take on it was very refreshing, I think.
Well, yeah, he did go on to have some very sort of sharp views about prenatal testing in the whole genetics community. And, he also authored articles with such titles as Silent Eugenics, right? And others. He took quite a strong stance about what he believed was a sort of silent policy to use his terms, right, to exterminate individuals with Down syndrome, et cetera. So some of his work later on in life becomes quite sharp in terms of tone and language. Yeah.
But I think people have worried about this, because I have a vague recollection of reading an article in the New York Times, I think about 25 years ago, about people becoming concerned about was Down syndrome going to become a thing of the past because of abortion. And my understanding is in the United States, the rate of Down syndrome, or the prevalence, really hasn't changed very much at all. Unlike in some European countries, I think it's sort of an urban myth that there hasn't been anybody born in Iceland in 20 years or whatever with Down syndrome. But I think the number of people born is very, very small each year.
It's true. I think it's always been somewhat amplified or exaggerated, dare I say, this trajectory, because there's so many other factors, right? Women are tending to have children at an older age. This is very much, again, a Western phenomenon, so it ignores 3/4 of the world's population. So yeah, it's a little more complicated than. And I didn't want to sort of pretend that, I'm just saying this is a theme that's sort of coming out a lot of sort of the end of Down syndrome, as it were, when, just as you suggest, I think it's easy to exaggerate that as a demographic trend. Anyway, I certainly take your point.
All right, so Julio Martinez Trujillo, who is the co-host with myself today, and Sarah, has a question. Julio, why don't you go ahead?
Yes, thank you very much, David. This is a really super interesting talk. I have a question. You talk about the case of Denmark, where you have prenatal diagnosis, and actually Rob just raised that issue. And I have it's about two different situations. For example, one situation is that we're getting better at prenatal diagnosis. So basically the trisomy 21 would be visible, and probably as we progress amniocentesis and all that kind of thing, it also happens. But there is one case that I'm very curious about for example, in vitro fertilization procedures. When people do in vitro fertilization procedures, do you have any number, any statistics, any information, if they happen to detect the trisomy 21 in some of the embryos, because these in vitro procedures happen, how does it work? Do you know exactly, I mean, there are these two cases, and whether this is we're going to see a decline over time in the incidence or prevalence of Down syndrome?
Oh my, well, that's a fascinating question. But again, I'm unfortunately going to have to just claim that I'm not an expert on that particular issue or have any special knowledge. My guess would be that, of course, these would be any through in vitro, right? Any particular detection of disability or chromosomal anomalies would be excluded, immediately. But again, sort of speaking as a sort of historical demographer, what percentage of society are born through in vitro right now, right? We're still probably talking about a very, very small percentage. There's still a significant number of individuals who don't get tested either for ethical, religious, practical reasons, and so just as we're going to have the child we're going to have, right, and don't engage in prenatal testing. And so I think the Denmark piece in the Atlantic Monthly was very much, I think, emphasizing really a sort of culture and society where it is extremely widespread and available, right? For a long time, amniocentesis in North America was quite sort of restricted based on age. You had to be, women had to be like minimum 33 or minimum 35 or what have you. And, in the US, perhaps there are many HMOs that had different, different regulations in terms of whether it was free, whether it wasn't free, et cetera. So I think it's sort of a complicated area, but, the very, very specific, how is this dealt with in terms of in vitro fertilization? I thought I saw Dr. Goldberg put his hand up. So maybe I can sort of steer this towards individuals who are more familiar with the medical scientific literature of the last few years on this.
I don't know if Dr. Goldberg lowered his hand because it's not raised now, but Ben, if you wanted to say something, please.
Yeah.
Julio, just looking quickly in Google, though, there's always like 10 million results for any search in Google, I think. But there's something from last year talking about that in embryos now, there's a possibility of detecting trisomy 21, and there's a question about are people IVF pregnancy is more likely to be Down syndrome perhaps more likely, or birth defects in general more likely in that group. But I think we have to keep in mind, this is something that when I first heard, it was surprising that we talk so much about women as they get older, there's a greater risk of Down syndrome and so on. But the fact of the matter remains that most people with Down syndrome are born to women under the age of 35. That yes, the risk increases, although I don't know, based on what Dr. Wright was saying, it'd be interesting to look at figures now because people are having kids at a much later age. And so the numerator presumably is much bigger than it would have been in the past. And so do we still talk about the same age frames and increasing rates? Dr. Goldberg was, hang on, there's something in the questions here, David.
Oh, actually, it's from Adele Goldberg. Oh my goodness. Hello, Adele. So you should put your video on, so Adele, so I can wave to you. So
if I can, David, I would also just tell you this is like a reunion, because a few years ago when we had the very first research day named after Dr. Goldberg, his son was the was one of the main speakers. So it's really the Goldberg Wright research day, we'll call it.
Maybe it is. Well, actually, when I was going online looking for images for this presentation, I did Adele, if that is it from Adele and not from Ben Goldberg. I did see a picture of the old house, and it was looking not very, I'm pretty sure it was the house on Cedar Drive, which for a long time was not properly kept up, I think it's fair to say. So anyways, there's a question though from Adele Goldberg. Hi, David, regards from the Goldberg family. There has been so much change in attitude and opportunities since Susie was young. What would Susie and your family see as next steps? Oh my goodness. It's a great question. I'm trying to, sort of think of where I would go with that. I apropos my comments previously, and this is completely self-interested, but I do think one of the huge challenges right now is providing facilities for aged Down syndrome adults. We've been just sort of encountering this in our own family, how to sort of sensitize, residential facilities for seniors, to accept and incorporate the special needs of Down syndrome adults in late age, and also married Down syndrome adults or married developmental disability adults. So Susie was married to a man who was in Oxford Regional Center for 40 years, who didn't have Down syndrome, but was developmentally disabled. And unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago, but we were looking for possible residential facilities that could include both of them, and they simply were non-existent. So this, again, is a very sort of self-interested issue, but I think that those opportunities are very much needed in the community right now in terms of providing a sort of broader array of services for developmentally disabled adults. So that would be the first thing I think to come to mind. I think the integration in the educational system has been largely good. It's not perfect, and individuals with developmental disabilities have a range of needs, some of which can be reasonably easily accommodated as we're mainstream classrooms, some of which can't. But I think educational integration has been quite successful in the last 50 years. I think employment integration has been very patchy and not terribly successful, again, case by case. Residential, I think we're still in transition again, in terms of facilities for the elderly. So I think those would be sort of general areas. And I do know that that I speak as, talk about my positionality, right? But we're a prosperous middle-class family with connections, who are university educated, who can pull strings. And, I do recognize that. And so I'm speaking, in terms of my own experience, but I do understand that there's probably all sorts of families who do not necessarily have the networks and the connections that we've had over the last several decades, and my parents have made over the last several decades, who probably have other issues that they would highlight that I'm just not, I'm not as aware of because of my own background.
Are there, we have time still, so if there are other questions or comments for Dr. Wright?
Actually, Rob.
Yeah, Julio is raising a non-virtual hand.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
So that's I have a question to tell you, kind of a story to see your comments. When I was at McGill, actually, that was in 2000, around 2007, 2000. So I remember that the in vitro clinic came up, and it was a lot of thing in vitro fertilization. And I remember that one of the I saw a lot of Jewish people from the plateau, from the Jewish community, coming to the clinic. And I was surprised about that because, well, religion. But then I talked to some of them, and they told me that a rabbi and someone, they decided that was okay. The in vitro fertilization was a procedure or something like that. That's what I was very interested in thinking about. Well, what about if you have 3 or 4 embryos, and the 3 or 4 embryos have trisomy 21, for example, when are they going to be implanted or not? Or if you know anything specifically about that, the intersection between that and religion is something that I know that the sample size is so low. But how do you see that exactly?
Yeah, well, again, I can only speak as a sort of United Church nonconformist Protestant, and I can't. I'm sensitive to, obviously there's been, the Catholic Church has taken a very strong stance, against amniocentesis, against selective termination. That's very, it's very well known. I can't speak necessarily for the Jewish community, which no doubt has pluralistic attitudes towards this, towards amniocentesis and the like, or the Muslim community or the Hindu community or what have you. I do know that there was a fast, if I can just sort of move this sideways into sort of legal issues, I do know that in the very litigious nature of the United States, there were some very famous lawsuits against doctors for not providing amniocentesis or alerting families for amniocentesis who then had a child who had Down syndrome and who rather unfortunately decided then to sue a health authority or a doctor for what were called, and I know this is a terrible term, but this was a term that was used for a wrongful life suit. Okay, and this there were many of these in the 1980s. Unfortunately, I highlighted a couple in the book, but where these lawsuits are going on. So people were feeling that they ought to have had this provided. They were wronged legally by having a Down syndrome child, and they were suing the appropriate authority. So there was a whole sort of legal dimension to this as well, which I think in retrospect is extremely unfortunate in terms of what it says about social values and disability. But this certainly was prominent in the 1980s, certainly in the United States. Few cases in Canada, but Canadians tend to be a little less litigious in this respect than the Americans.
Thanks.
I'm seeing some things in the chat, so I am.
No, that's just that's around Adele asking questions about other people's use of technology, we'll say. But the but you see how it's changed. There was, I don't know if it's still there on York Street, right near.
Can you hear me now?
Oh, yep, Ben. Hello. I think your daughter, Adele, was a bit concerned about you, but I reassured her that for me, you are the benchmark in terms of people being able to use technology and stuff. So please go ahead, Ben.
Okay, I just wanted to make a very special thank you to David, because the Goldberg family and the Wright family have been intertwined for a couple generations, mainly through them going after chocolate chip cookies in our home. But what I wanted to emphasize particularly was the role of David's parents in the field. You showed a picture of the parents who started the local association, but they've been the driving force in terms of integration. And I recall being on the legislative committee of the American Association, running into Elizabeth Boggs and Rod Turnbull. Boggs was a nuclear physicist. Turnbull was a major attorney general in the United States. And they were the ones behind Kennedy's plan for changing the attitudes in the United States. So I would say not to underestimate the power of your parents.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Goldberg. It's delightful to hear your voice. And yes, one's always a bit sort of. I'm very proud of what my parents achieved, and what I try to emphasize in the book was how, dare I say, sort of, people who are not activists at the time. My parents were just parents, right? They had three sons, and then they had my daughter, and then they sort of unexpectedly became involved in these associations at the local level, and these happened across North America, and as it were, average parents became sort of unexpected activists on the front line of disability rights in the 1970s and integration battles, fighting all these particular battles around going to school and access to employment, what have you. And I think sometimes when we focus too much on scientific discovery or what have you, we forget about these sort of social movements, of which absolutely my parents, to their credit, were at the forefront in London, but they're representative of a larger social movement that was so important, I think, in terms of saying, no, we're not sending our children to formal institutions, and we're demanding rights and dignity for our children at that time. So no, absolutely, and my thoughts are entirely concurrent with yours. So thank you for that.
And I would echo that. So I'm sure you know, David, that your mother is on the Developmental Disabilities Program advisory board, and is always a very sort of active member. And I was thinking when you were saying earlier that that Susie was fortunate to have strong advocates for parents and things, I'm pretty sure your mom and your dad wouldn't have let it be any other way in terms of what she was afforded and given the ability to have. So it probably works in multiple directions, but yeah, she's a very lucky person to have your parents as parents. I think when you talk about average people, one of our research awards is named after C. Kingsley Allison, who I think was the vice president of OPG Canada, who I believe also had a daughter with Down syndrome. And on her death 10 or 15 years ago, I think a fairly large amount of money was endowed to developmental disabilities program at Western and to Community Living London, I think.
Great. Yeah, and London was a fascinating, very, very vibrant and fascinating city in the 1970s in terms of having the university, having CPRI. London was a sort of relatively well-off city in terms of providing for strong voluntary organizations. Obviously, it's very gendered in the in this 1950s, 60s, and 70s. You have university-educated women like my mom, who traditionally would not have gone at that time into the professions, right? And then after their children got into sort of high school, then became very active in the voluntary sector and had a huge impact on social institutions, right? So there's all these sort of layers to it that made London, I think, quite a fascinating, almost incubator for some of these issues in the 1970s. So,
Are there other questions for Dr. Wright? Either out loud or by raising your hand or in the chat or Q&A or smoke signal, whatever people would like to use. As you would, when you were talking about sort of the early institutions and how they were founded for children, what happened to people with intellectual disabilities and Down syndrome and things before institutions, whether we're talking about North America or the rest of the world? I mean, what would happen to them generally?
That is the $64,000 question, Rob. We don't know. So the short answer is we don't know. I think there's reasonable historical speculation. Some historians, even Michel Foucault, but talking about those with psychiatric disorders, have argued that in the pre-industrial period, that individuals with disabilities were more accepted, were more integrated into local communities. People knew them. They were asked to perform sort of activities that were whether commensurate with their ability, et cetera, that there was a greater sense of acceptance and support and integration. Now, it's a reasonable historical hypothesis. Now, whether it actually was the truth or not, we don't know. And I think there's also a sort of counter arguments around people who looked at the history of infanticide, the history of childhood abandonment. These are obviously very somber and disturbing topics historically, but to show that this was quite widespread as well. And so sometimes I think we might have a romantic view of the pre-industrial period where everyone's sort of happy and going to these community fairs and, but in fact, maybe it wasn't as positive as we might like to think. So, as historians, we can only deal with the sources we have, and the sources that we have tend to be generated by institutions, medical authorities, or legal authorities, right? And so we do have legal documents that go back to the medieval period. They're very fragmentary, but they talk about how a son who's supposed to inherit, the property of his father, for example, but was born congenitally developmentally disabled. And so they have to make these legal arrangements of how, so it gives you a little bit of insight in terms of how, care was transferred between different members of the family or, with kin, or even the state used a sort of wardship system. So it's all very fascinating, but it's hard to make a generalization because of the historical sources are just so fragmented at the end of the day.
Is it possible to think that what would happen to whether there was infanticide or whether they were just accepted and as part of the community, would that perhaps relate to the level of disability, but also the severity of behavior problems? Because I'm thinking of some of the patients we see who are very aggressive or self-injurious.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure what would have happened to those people 400 or 500 years ago.
I suspect it wouldn't have been a good situation. I don't mean to be flippant about this, but when I worked at CPRI, I had very brief, and I don't want to sort of exaggerate, but I would go to cottage 13, 14, and there were some children with some pretty severe behaviors. And I for Dieter Blindert, I went and I did research. I went around to the different schedule facilities. You know, I went to Blenheim, I went to Huroney, I went to Smith Falls, etc. And I saw the specialist units that were for the most extreme self-injurious behaviors. So, you know, I don't have a sort of rose-tinted, you know, these are really, really, really difficult cases. And, you know, if I sort of put my historian's hat on and think, you know, how would they have been treated? Well, there has been a little bit of historical research to show how, you know, individuals with extreme behaviors, whether adult psychiatric behaviors or child developmental disabilities, were in fact sometimes locked in cabins on a property or in a particular room or beaten or whatever. You know, it's not a very pleasant, you know, historical record. So yes, I absolutely take your point that part of it would be behavioral. Part of it would also be a function of the wealth of the family, right? People who had more, you know, who had some servants might have had more opportunities to, you know, have a servant look after part of the day, you know, their daughter, right, or their son or their aunt or what have you. And people who are living subsistence levels wouldn't have had that opportunity. So I think there's a number of factors. Yeah, behavioral, age, wealth, you name it. So.
Just one more PS. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
That picture that you showed of Lejeune getting an award from President Kennedy.
Yeah, I'll get it back here. Yeah.
The tall gentleman to the left is Murray Barr, the discoverer of the Barr body.
Oh, I didn't know. Thank you for that. I didn't. I didn't know. I never knew what Barr looked like. I certainly know. I know who Barr was, but isn't that fascinating?
Yeah, essentially, he was one of the founders of CPRI because he wanted to have a cytogenetics laboratory available close to the institutions. So Murray Barr was a very strong proponent of the development of CPRI.
Well, isn't that fascinating? Well, thank you for that. And yeah, certainly the Barr bodies. You know, there is a fascinating sort of London connection going on here. But you know, Dr. Goldberg, if you recognize anybody else in this photo, I would be delighted if you could email me because I use it, but obviously just with respect to, I have a whole lecture I give on Lejeune because he's such a fascinating individual. But I didn't know that was Barr. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's possible that standing next to Murray Barr, and I can't remember his name, was the president of the American Association of Mental Retardation, and he was also the president of the American Psychiatric. And right now, my memory forgets.
Well, I'm sure a little Google search we could figure out perhaps who that would have been. So anyway, thank you again for that.
So David, thank you for the talk. I mean, that was as always. I've been to 2 or 3 and they've been fantastic. I will just one final plug that if anybody's interested in David's book on Down syndrome, which I'm sure everybody is, but first of all, you know, obviously go to Amazon and buy it. But if that's not your choice, then I have a copy of it. And if anybody would like to borrow it, please let me know. I'd be happy to lend it to people to read. It's a wonderful read. So David, thank you again for this. It was a fantastic start to the day, and I think we all really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for the invitation again, and have a great afternoon.
Yep. All right.